Okay, so welcome everybody to the new seminar series of the Association for the Advancement of Affective Computing. That we're really excited we could finally get it started. And well, the aim of the series of seminars that will run monthly, more or less, is to to provide, on the one hand, is to present the latest research in affective computing, but also to reflect critically on it and on key research, including pioneering research, seminal and state-of-the-art research in all areas and disciplines related to affective computing. So we'll have a very broad range of speakers, many different disciplines that are different stages in their careers. And the other objective is more educational, so to initiate people who are maybe starting their PhDs or starting research in affective computing to what the main developments in seminal research. So this is part of the newly created Committee for Education and Early Career activities that I am glad to be able to chair. So I am really glad that to open the series we can have Professor Andrew Ortony, and I am going to spotlight you. Now you're now you're on camera. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. To talk about one of the most influential books, possibly on the affective computing community. The first edition was published in 1988, and the book is by three authors. So Andrew Ortony is the first one, but it's also Clore and Collins. Unfortunately, I think neither of the other co-authors can be here today, but they send regards. And second edition has just been published, so 35 years after the first one. So Andrew is going to just tell us all about this book, The Cognitive Structure of Emotions, that we probably all of us know as OCC after Ortony, Clore and Collins. So this this work is was widely used in the affective computing community because it's very easily formalizable in a way, and Professor Ortony will tell us all about it. So a brief note about him. So he's now Professor Emeritus of Psychology, Education and Computer Science at Northwestern University in the US. He's a cognitive scientist, and he's best known for his research on emotions, but also research on metaphor. And he also had a very influential book on metaphor. So what else could I say? I mean, he's really well known by this community and other communities. He has authored hundreds of papers. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the American Psychological Society. Maybe something that people know a bit less is that between 2008 and 2013, he built an interdisciplinary computational social cognition research group in Singapore at A*STAR, and and that group was the foundation of today's social and cognitive computing department at the A*STAR Institute for High Performance Computing. Okay, so after all these introductions, I'm just going to let Andrew to start the talk. Thank you again, and you can share your screen, and the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Lola. Hello, everybody from sunny New York, just north of New York City. Um, Ordinarily, I'd say it's a pleasure to be here, but I've been here anyway, so that doesn't work on Zoom. Um, so thank you for inviting me. I'll do the best I can to give you some sort of perspective on the OCC model. Um, and of course, immediately I do that, it doesn't work. Nothing works. Slides don't advance. We just tested it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but we tested it 2 seconds ago. There we go.
Yeah.
All right.
Excellent.
So, as Lola explained, OCC is derived from the initial letters of the surnames of the three authors. In the second edition, which is hot off the press, just published in the middle of August, there's also a contributed chapter by Jonathan Gratch and Stacey Marcella, for which we're very grateful. And there they review the effect of OCC, the influence of OCC on affective computing over the last many years. So here's a brief outline of the talk. First, I'll discuss some of my favorite key problems for emotion theories, which will give me a sort of more general context. In that context of which I'll introduce the goals of OCC, and there'll be some preliminary issues which I'll discuss, some of which are related to the key problems that I've laid out. Then I'll discuss the general structure of the OCC model. I'll talk about how it handles intensity of emotions, how we characterize what we call emotion types, which you might think of as distinct emotions. Then a little about how the model attempts to formalize emotions, and then I'll stop. So first, some key problems. I'm going to discuss 4 issues that I take to be interesting challenges and issues for theories of emotion in general. Definition of emotion, the question of intensity of emotions, the role of language in emotion research, and the question of basic emotions. One might think it curious that there's no agreed upon definition of emotion that's used by emotion theorists, regardless of whether they're philosophers or psychologists or computer scientists or anthropologists. People don't agree on what an emotion is. Some people think that they're states, some people think they're events, some people think they're intrinsically psychological, some people think they're intrinsically located in the body, and so on. It turns out that there's a real problem if you try to define emotions by example. I mean, many definitions, if you can't give a definition in the usual sense, you can sometimes home in on the meaning of a concept by giving examples. As we'll see, excuse me, the examples such as happy, sad, disgust, fear, and so on have some shortcomings as a way of delimiting the concept. Another problem with the lack of definition is that it means that there's no good criterion for distinguishing emotions from non-emotions, examples of which I claim would be states such as that of being surprised or curious. And there's also no agreement as to how to individuate emotions. In a famous paper by Paul Ekman in the 1990s, early 1990s, he argued that one of the characteristics of emotions was that they were very brief. By very brief, he meant a few seconds. On the other hand, one might argue, that's really not typically the case. I mean, if somebody is worried about some forthcoming event, a student worried about an examination, they can be anxious for hours in anticipation of the event. Or the death of a loved one can grieve for hours or days or in some sense years, although it's slightly different. So Are they very brief, or are they persistent, or are they both? Again, no agreement on these issues. It would help, of course, if one were to define the construct, and that way maybe one could constrain some of these issues. So the general result of the lack of a definition is there's a sort of confusion about what emotion theories are actually theories of, which is sort of bizarre in a way, certainly not typical in the physical sciences. So much for the problem of definition. When we come to the intensity issue, I believe that emotion theorists have failed to recognize the great importance of the fact that emotions vary a great deal in intensity. It's a much neglected topic in emotion research, and there are huge differences of emotions as you move in the intensity of emotions as you move from one emotion to another. As you'll see in a moment, I think there's evidence that there's a failure to acknowledge that much of emotional life involves only rather low level, not very intense emotions. So let's just take a look at some old data. It was published in a paper that Jerry Clore and I published in collaboration with our dear friend Nico Freider. And just very briefly, let me explain what this is. The blue bars represent an intensity range of different emotions. So the range of this disliking emotion is 5.7 on an 11-point scale. The scale ranged from 0, which was barely noticeable, to 10, which subjects were told was the strongest feeling you could possibly imagine. And these are the mean values. So this is the mean minimum, about 2, and the mean maximum, close to 8, of disliking. And if you compare that with terrified, as you would expect, the mean maximum is very, very high. It's around 9. But it's a much more restricted range. Obviously, terrified refers to a much more restricted range of fear than does fear itself, which has a much more broad range, ranging from something very low, a little under 3, to something close to 8. These red dots in the middle represent the mean values of subject ratings of what they consider to be the typical intensity of that emotion. So for anger, the rating was typically around around 7, and I didn't say that very well. What I should say is that people said on average, people said the typical rating of anger was around 7, which was, by the way, this vertical line here is the overall mean of all the emotion terms that were presented to subjects, averaged across all subjects and all emotions. Just to look at this in very general terms, notice how many of these emotions have relatively low ranges, okay? And even here, where they seem to be in the sort of lower half, they're still not even 4, okay? So on this scale, there are a lot of cases where people say, you know, the average minimum intensity of this emotion is pretty low. And that's what I mean when I say a lot of emotional life involves only low-level emotions. Now, what's interesting about the failure to study emotion intensity very carefully is that this fact has some very interesting implications. Emotions that are not intense rarely manifest the concomitants of emotions that emotion theorists love to study in great detail. Of these, the most important is the so-called facial expression of emotions, where the emphasis is on the word expression. I don't think the face is expressing anything. It might be reflecting something, but it's not expressing anything. But we can't expect everybody to be as pedantic as to worry about that. But a lot of research has been devoted to studying the relationship between facial expressions and emotion, and attempts to identify unique physiology associated with particular emotions. But if in fact I've, left my wallet with $2 in it and nothing else on the bus, or with $10 on it, I might be a little disturbed by this. I might worry about it for 2 or 3 minutes, or think about it. But I'm certainly not going to have very, very strong evidence in my face or in my physiology of the fact that I'm very slightly upset one way or another about this. And I think more generally, we go through life not jumping from one intense emotional experience to another, but gliding almost unnoticeably from very low level, low intense emotions to another. One sees a friend one hasn't seen since yesterday, and one smiles and says hello, and one feels sort of a vague sense of some positive affect. But one isn't going to have some huge reaction that everybody on the planet can see and measure and be excited about. So I think this lack of serious attention to the question of emotion intensity means that theories of emotion are incomplete and sometimes misguided, and so is the research. And I think some evidence for this I'll mention when I come to discuss the basic emotions question. One of the biggest problems, in my opinion, for research in emotion relates to the influence of language of emotions on the way we theorize and talk about emotions. I recommend that anybody in any field who's going to do emotion research read this excellent paper by Alan Fisk, published in 2020, The Lexical Fallacy in Emotion Research, Mistaking Vernacular Words for Psychological Entities, published in a Psychological Review. This is an absolute excellent paper that discusses some of these issues and problems. Also, another very important source to look at when considering this issue is the work of Anna Wierzbicka in general, in particular her 1999 book, Emotions Across Languages and Cultures, Diversity and Universals. These two people are very, very well aware of the pitfalls of language in thinking about emotions. One of the great sources of data about emotions comes especially and mostly actually from the US, where we psychologists have for years collected data from undergraduate students and then made generalizations about those data about people in general. This is an instance of depending on information about some domain by relying on people from what are called weird cultures again, in a famous paper by Henrich and colleagues in 2010. And they're weird in the sense that they mean them to be Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and developed. And of course, the majority of people on the planet, all of whom we suppose experience emotions, are not actually from weird cultures. So one has to be careful here, and one has to realize where so many of the data are coming from. Associated with this is the fact that most theories of emotions, because they're collected from people in these cultures, especially in English, but English-speaking cultures, these theories focus on emotions that are lexicalized in English. There are English words that drive the research. Now, this is a problem because some words that are very, very salient in our culture, a word like disgust, for example, there's no word for it, for example, in the South American language Arawak. I think Arawak also has no word for sad, if I recall. This is a point that Wierzbicka made. So there are some cultures that don't even have words for emotions, which in our culture lexicalized and readily accessible in the way we think and talk about emotional life. So language is a problem, partly because of the specificity of languages that are used to do emotion research. But more generally, it's clear that language cannot reveal the underlying structure of emotional reality. Emotion words and distinct emotions are simply not isomorphic. There's no one-to-one relation between emotion words and distinct emotions. By the way, I should make clear already at this point that I think that rage and anger are the same emotion in the sense that they're different intensities of the same distinct emotion, or what later on I will refer to as emotion types. Otherwise, one simply has, an infinite number of emotions in the same sense that one has an infinite number of colors. But to make sense of the color perception, one doesn't say much to say that there are an infinite number of possible colors that one can perceive. But when I say that there's no isomorphic relation between emotion words and distinct emotions, consider the following. The one emotion, fear, I'll call it fear in quotes, fear type emotions. There are very many words that map onto that one emotion type. Anxiety, worry, I mean, you can argue about whether fear and anxiety are the same emotion type or not. But for the moment, for the sake of argument, let's assume that they are. So fear and anxiety and worry and concern and trepidation and terror, all of these words are fear words. So there are many words that map onto this one emotion type. There are other emotions in English, we call it relief, for which there appears to be only one word. There is a one-to-one mapping between relief emotions, between words for relief and that one type of emotion. I don't mean the variations in intensity, I mean the one type. Then we have the problem that there are cases of one word mapping onto many different emotions. Words like upset and bothered can refer to anything from anger and fear and embarrassment and shame and disappointment. All manner of emotions can be referred to by the word upset and similarly bothered. And then there are also interesting cases where there are emotions for which English has no one word. The most common example that English-speaking people are familiar with is Schadenfreude. But Schadenfreude is a loan word from German. Why? Because there is no English word for it. So English speakers adopted a word from another language to characterize a particular emotion. So the main point here is emotion words and distinct emotions do not relate in any direct and predictable manner. So all of this leads to what I call the salience error. That is, that emotions that are culturally and linguistically salient and accessible, like happy, sad, angry, and so on, tend to distort thinking about what's typical in emotional life. And so if disgust and sadness are thought to be typical emotions, they don't do so well in Arawak because they can't even talk about them in any direct way. So the result of all this, I claim, is that there's a focus in emotion research and theorizing on culturally and linguistically salient emotions. And that this focus, this is a sort of bias that reduces the generality of emotion theories. So again, I recommend anybody doing research on emotion, take a look at the Fisk paper and at the Wierzbicka book to get a sort of broader perspective. There are others, anthropologists, of course, have written in many cases, but they tend to be voices in the wilderness and don't get the attention that they ought to. Okay, finally, a topic that I don't want to go into in great detail because I've done so in a couple of papers elsewhere, most recently in a paper, Are All Basic Emotions Emotions? A Problem for the Basic Emotion Construct. But there has been a preoccupation for the last 30 or 40 years with the study of what are called basic or primary emotions. And you find this, it doesn't matter whether they're psychologists or computer scientists or neuroscientists, there's still a sort of a belief that there must be some basic emotions, just like there are some basic chemical elements. I find this very, very problematic, primarily because every author has a different conception of what the criteria for basicness are, although very often they won't even tell you that, how many basic emotions there are, which are the basic emotions, and I think there's very little consensus on this. Here is a way of seeing this. If you take the top row here, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 18 at the moment, as of today's count, 18 basic emotions, according to what, by the way, I think is excellent work by Cowan and Keltner. The point isn't the quality of work, the problem is thinking of them as basic emotions, or at least the field interpreting them that way. So you've got 18 up here, and down here you've got 2 or 3. And yeah, most of them have anger in there, I'll concede that. And most of them have fear. But no, Weiner and Graham in an influential paper just had happiness and sadness. I'm very much more sympathetic to this sort of view that says the only thing that's basic about basic emotions is basic positive or negative affect. But anyway, the point here is to give you some sense of the huge range in terms of the number of things that are claimed to be so-called basic emotions and their identity. So if you look at Panksepp and Watt, Panksepp, of course, was a neuroscientist, so has a different perspective on this. But here, these aren't, for the most part, emotions at all. Seeking, fear, rage, lust, care, panic, these are behaviors, if you ask me. But anyway, this is, in my view, a problem for basic emotion theorists. So I see the basic emotion construct as very ill-defined. As Rainer Reisenstein pointed out, there are actually nobody has come up with compelling rules for how basic emotions relate, or put the other way, how non-basic emotions are related to the basic emotions. So I think of the basic emotions construct as being one of relatively little utility. And I think that this focus has resulted in decades of work on what I think of as signs of emotions, in particular facial expressions, rather than emotions themselves. Okay, well, so much for my whining about what I'm unhappy about. What are we going to do about it? This brings me to the goals of OCC, which I take, in fact, to be a kind of methodological existence proof. I want OCC to be thought of as evidence that it's possible to do certain things in emotion theories without leaning on troublesome constructs or unreliable concomitants of emotions. So we have, for example, committed to an explicit minimal definition of emotions. I think it's important, at least people know what we're talking about. I think that one of the goals of OCC, I don't think one of the goals of OCC is to conceptualize emotions in a linguistically and culturally neutral way to the extent that that is possible. Now, it may not be absolutely possible to get rid of all linguistic and cultural influences on the way we talk about them, but at least to minimize the linguistic and cultural biases. And this for us means that one has to think about emotions in cognitive terms. We strove to develop a systematic characterization of different emotion types in a way that one could see clearly how they were related, how different emotion types relate to one another, how they differ from one another, and in what respects. We also focus very much on trying to identify factors that influence the intensity of different kinds of emotions or emotion types. And then, we wanted to provide sufficient specificity to permit computational modeling, not just because we wanted it to be possible to engage in computational modeling for its own sake, but also because we think computational modeling is a very good way of testing the coherence of theories. We are not amongst those who believe that computers or machines, non-biological entities, are capable of, quotes, having emotions. There are some people who believe this, some of whom people for whom I have great respect. We just don't share this view. I think that emotions are quintessentially biological functions, and one can simulate something without it actually being that thing. So in general, we want to minimize the role of troublesome constructs and unreliable concomitants. And of course, the most unreliable concomitant is that of the so-called facial expression. So here's a question: is this a woman in a state of happiness? Or is she unhappy? And think about it for a moment. And one thing to notice is actually what you're saying is, well, I can't tell from the face alone. It depends what's going on. What's the context? But the fact that you can't tell from the face alone is very, very important, because actually the context is much easier to predict what emotion she's likely to be experiencing than is the face. And actually she's in agony, and it's important to understand that even here one needs more context. I mean, has she just given birth and she's delighted to hear that it's a boy or a girl, or is she in the process and she's in agony? So the face alone is actually not really very diagnostic. Not to mention the fact that we have actors who are very good at expressing emotions when they don't actually feel them. Okay, so now for some preliminaries. We take emotions to be a subset of what we call affective states. So affect is a more general construct than emotion. Affect is anything that's viewed as valence, i.e. as positive or negative. So it includes moods. Affective states include moods or affective conditions, emotions. Some traits are affective, some motivations are affective. It's important to acknowledge that not everything that's affective, i.e. positive or negative, is necessarily an emotion. So here's a minimal definition of emotion. And for that, we would want to say there are three necessary but not sufficient conditions for a mental state to be an emotion. And in a sense, that it's a mental state could be thought to be, for us, a fourth necessary condition. First, as philosophers have long argued, emotions are intentional. That is, they have objects, they're about something. So when you're angry with someone, or you're angry that something happened, or angry about something. You can't just be angry without there being any object. Similarly with happy, you're happy about something, or happy that something happened, and you're afraid of this, and you're afraid that this will happen, and you're disgusted by the horrible sight or horrible mess and so on. But if you're sleepy, you're not sleepy about anything, you're just sleepy. And if you're irritable, you're in an irritable mood, and you don't need to be irritable about something, you're just irritable. So the fact that emotions are intentional distinguishes them from, for example, moods and bodily states like sleepiness. The fact that they have objects, that means that the object in some sense is the cognitive nexus of emotions. So emotions are about something. Emotions are affective states. In other words, they are valence. They're intrinsically positive or negative. There's a lot of discussion and argument about this in the literature, which is one of the reasons I think that there are a lot of problems. I think it makes more sense to say something like, if you're indifferent with respect to something, you can't be emotional about it. That being indifferent and being emotional are antithetical. So emotions are about things we care about. They're things that are of concern to us. And so being surprised and being curious, because they're not necessarily valenced, are not examples of emotions. Finally, and again, people may disagree, but at least we say what we mean when we're talking about emotions. Emotions for us are feelings. They're conscious experiences. Here we have on our side Freud, by the way, who also believed that the idea of unconscious emotions made absolutely no sense. There have been claims that there are unconscious emotions, but it turns out that what actually is going on is what's unconscious is an affective response, not an emotion. So we think that measured responses in terms of choice or behavior to subliminal stimuli is not evidence of unconscious emotions, but is evidence of unconscious affective states, general positive or negative valence. So for us, emotions are valenced feelings or reactions that are about things that concern us, and this enables us at least to keep out of the domain of emotions non-emotional states, things like sleepy, and moods like irritable. So how are we going to conceptualize emotions in as linguistically and culturally neutral way as possible? Well, first, we're going to have to focus on the characteristics of situations, not on emotion words themselves. One of the best ways to describe an emotion, if you don't have a word, is it's the way you feel when such and such happens. You know, so if you wanted to explain to a non-native speaker what is it to be embarrassed, you'd explain the kind of situations, the things that happen when somebody's embarrassed. This is very nicely influenced by a very old paper of Anna Wierzbicka 50 years ago. She wrote this in describing how Tolstoy was dealing, when he was writing Anna Karenina, dealing with the problem of not being able to find the right emotion word. And this is what Wierzbicka writes. Tolstoy's solution is to describe some characteristic situation and state, such as he felt as one would feel in a situation like that. Tolstoy trusts that we're able to imagine what one would feel in that situation. And if someone cannot imagine this, Tolstoy shrugs his shoulders, quotes, "I'm sorry, I cannot describe these feelings in any other way. If you don't understand, I can't do anything about it." I find this a very powerful and interesting, illuminating quotation. Okay, so we're going to view emotions as characterized in terms of some kind of cognitive characterization of situations. And we view emotions as emerging. And by the way, this is one important respect in which OCC 2 deviates from the 1988 first edition, where we talked about eliciting conditions. We now call them emergence conditions because we worry that eliciting conditions suggest that these things are lurking there waiting to be woken up and allowed to escape. I think a much better metaphor for what an emotion is the idea of an idea, that ideas emerge. They sort of just grow and come out of whatever was going on, but they're not sitting there waiting to be elicited. So we view emotions as emerging from psychologically important situations. Now, situations in which people find themselves and which they find to be psychologically important have to be construed or appraised. I mean, OCC is an appraisal theory, or interpreted. And appraising a situation is quintessentially a cognitive process. The only thing that's basic that we're going to require in thinking about basic emotions is that emotions are cognitively elaborated ways of feeling good or feeling bad. So the sort of fundamental stuff of emotions is pure positive or negative affect. After that, cognition does the work. And unlike facial expressions or physiological concomitants or so on, the cognitive bases of emotions are omnipresent regardless of the intensity of emotions. So however slight the emotion might be, it still requires the cognitive interpretation that gave rise to it, whereas there may be no facial expression or measurable physiological concomitants. So the general structure of OCC is based on the idea that we humans, at least, can make sense of our world, the worlds in which we live, in one of three possible ways, sometimes more than one at the same time. But we can either think about what's going on in terms of things that just happen, or in terms of things that someone does, or just things in general. Things that just happen we call events, and they're evaluated in terms, or praised in terms of the desirability of the event relative to goals. The things that people do, we'll call them agents more generally. The actions of agents are evaluated in terms of the praiseworthiness of what it is that they do relative to standards. And the things in general, objects, are evaluated in terms of how appealing they are relative to tastes. And we think of these blue things, goals, standards, and tastes, as basically being the value system that subserves emotions in general. And these three different kinds of values are associated with three generic affective reactions, which we call satisfaction or dissatisfaction, approval or disapproval, liking or disliking. And I should say already here, we're using these words as the best labels we can find to explain what it is we mean in terms of the situations that are involved here. So this gives rise to three broad classes of emotions, what we call event-based emotions, agent-based emotions, and object-based emotions. And this is really just a repetition of this. These are three broad classes. And then in addition, we do in OCC have a group of compound emotions, which involve simultaneously considering what's going on in terms of the event and the action, what it was that somebody or something did, and the desirability of the associated event. These are compound emotions. Interestingly for us, anger turns out, well, we have an emotion which we refer to as anger emotions, which involves both evaluation of the praiseworthiness of an action or blameworthiness in the case of anger, and the undesirability of the associated event. So here we have these three broad categories, and we've satisfaction, dissatisfaction, approval, disapproval, liking, disliking. If some entity is incapable of taking one of these perspectives, then they're also incapable of taking any emotions associated with that perspective. That's sort of important, because you might think that many animals might be able to evaluate the desirability of some event, but not be able to evaluate, not have the cognitive machinery required to evaluate the praiseworthiness or blameworthiness of an action. And therefore, emotions related to praiseworthiness and so on would be inaccessible, whereas some of the emotions related to events would be. Again, these terms, satisfied, dissatisfied, and so on, we think of as generic affective states. It's more like, well, you're feeling okay or not okay about things in general. Below these are distinct emotion types, and these are cognitively elaborated or differentiated forms of these kinds of feelings. So the first thing we'll look at, I'll look at some examples now. We see here what we call the well-being emotions. Distinct emotions, emotion types, are cognitively elaborated forms of such feelings. For example, here we might have a negative feeling, which just tells you it's a valence, it's negative, about, and what's it about? It's about an undesirable event, as general as that. Something undesirable happened. So we can unpack this, what we call emotion group now, the well-being emotions. This is the group name. And it gives us two very general kinds of specific emotions or emotion types, what we call joy emotions and distress emotions. And it's important to realize, again, to emphasize, should I say, about the word joy and distress here and here. These are merely convenient labels for emotion types. They're placeholders, not definienda. We're not trying to define joy or distress. What we're trying to do is find some abbreviated way of explaining what we mean by a positive feeling about a desirable event. It's something roughly like joy. Examples of emotion words in English for it would be happy and pleased, or distressed and unhappy. We can get more specific about the kind of desirable or undesirable event. And when we do that, we might, for example, focus on events that are desirable or undesirable for us, but only insofar as they're desirable or undesirable for somebody else. And this would essentially be to further specify the kind of desirable or undesirable event. And we then would have what we call fortunes of others group, where you cross the desirability for self with the desirability for the other person. All of these variables, desirability and undesirability, are from the perspective of the experiencing person or agent. That is, the person, agent, I'll call it person for the moment, has to view what's going on as desirable, has to view it as undesirable, has to view it as, it doesn't matter whether it's objectively desirable for the other person. In the case of Schadenfreude, I believe that what happened to this other person will be judged to be undesirable for them, and I like that fact, it's desirable for me. But I'm not defining Schadenfreude here, I'm defining a positive feeling about an event that is undesirable for someone else. Okay, Schadenfreude is a good word for that. So another sort of group that involves an elaboration of simply joy and distress of being positive or negative, desirable or undesirable events, are what we call prospect-based emotions. And those of you who know OCC probably know this better than almost any other group. We've changed this now. We are not so much interested in the prospect of events, but in events that you envisage, something you sort of bring to mind and entertain the possibility of. If it's positive, then you have something roughly like a hope emotion. That's quite interestingly problematic, the word hope here, and fear emotions. And if the envisaged event, if you believe it happened, you get emotions which we're going to label roughly as gratification, fears confirmed. That is, you thought something bad was going to happen, and you now believe it did happen, your fears are confirmed. There's no good English word for this feeling, but if you're driving along the freeway at night or road at night and it's dark and your gas gauge shows you're going to run out of gas and you're worried about it, and suddenly your car splutters to a halt in the middle of nowhere and it's dark and foggy and raining, and you kind of knew this bad thing was going to happen, and you have this very characteristic feeling. It's as it were the opposite of disappointment, which is when you thought something good was going to happen and it didn't. And so we can elaborate these two, and in much the same way, we have words that we try to sort of relate to these definitions here of a positive feeling about, or what we call characterizations, a positive feeling about an envisaged desirable event. Hope isn't a great word for it, I'll come to that in a moment, but I think you probably hope you get the general idea here. Now, moving over very hurriedly to the praiseworthiness of actions, I'm not going to go into this at all in detail, just to say that you can approve either of your own agency or of the agency of some other person, and this gives you different emotion types. When you move over to the how appealing objects are relative to tastes, which are sort of generic liking or disliking of things, we have now introduced, and one of the interesting things about OCC is one can do this. We've now further elaborated this into whether one likes or dislikes something that one takes to be capable of emotions or something that one takes to be incapable of emotions. And this gives us rather different options, looking like this. Affection emotions, enmity emotions, appreciation and distaste emotions. I'll show you this a little larger. Here you see that I'll just show you images which may help you see this immediately. So if you find something that you believe to be capable of emotions appealing, we call these a positive feeling about an appealing, emotional, capable object. And there you think that this little girl is, is showing some love for a new sibling. Here, an unappealing object that's capable of emotions, taken to be capable of emotions, would be something like this. This is maybe something that somebody that most people hate. An appreciation emotion for something incapable of emotion. Okay. Now, this is sort of the appreciation, if you like, aesthetic appreciation of beauty, which is a different form of liking, we think. And similarly, maybe something akin to disgust, a negative feeling about an unappealing, emotion incapable object would be this. I don't want you to have to look at that very long, so I'll get rid of it. It's pretty gross. So this gives you the overall structure, slightly different from OCC 1, because the envisaged events, things are different, and this is different. Compound emotions we also have, which I don't have time to go into, but are the union, if you like, of these two branches. Just very quickly, Stoinebrink and Dastani and Meyer, working out of Holland a number of years ago, proposed that there was another way of representing this, which was a true inheritance hierarchy. And I think that I'm actually very sympathetic to their concerns about this. And I just wanted to show that it's possible to re-represent all this stuff in a way that is really a true inheritance hierarchy, rather than just the logical structure that we were showing above. But again, I don't have time to discuss it, only to say that we think it's helpful and good when an account such as OCC can be elaborated by other people, improved on. It's certainly not the last word. Okay, I'll have to move on a little faster now to the intensity question. As I said, it's rarely discussed, but high intensity seems to be assumed by a lot of theoretical work because they're always assuming that it has measurable features which it may not have. We proposed 3 major classes of intensity variables as we did in OCC 1, what we call global, central, and local. The global intensity variables include things like the existing level of arousal, the unexpectedness of whatever is the situation that's being evaluated, psychological proximity. They're global in the sense that it really doesn't matter which of the 3 branches the emotion is on. These variables can, in principle, affect the intensity of any emotion anywhere. The central intensity variables are very easy. They're the desirability, praiseworthiness, and appeal, the ones located with the 3 branches. And the local variables are ones which apply only to local emotion groups within a branch. So for prospect-based emotion, the likelihood of an event, undesirable event that's envisaged, is going to influence the intensity, or how deserving you think or undeserving somebody for whom you feel Schadenfreude is will influence its intensity. And so you can redo the structure that I showed you, the overall structure of OCC, showing the intensity variables. The red ones are the central variables associated with the branches, and down here, the intensity variables that influence the intensity of emotions in particular groups. So the general characterization of emotion types is that we're going to always give the valence a positive, negative feeling or reaction, and then we're going to talk about the emergence conditions. Then we're going to, so this is really sort of exploits the type token definition that linguists use. This is the type. Here are English tokens. These are English words or expressions that have the type specification as part of their meaning, and I'm going to give some examples in a moment. And then we have a specification of the variables. So to look at the characterization first of fear emotions, which is a case of the emotion words where there is a many-to-one relationship, many emotion words, one emotion type. Here are a lot of the emotion words, emotion tokens, so there are many of them. We have what we call a fear emotion, and we put fear in quotes because it's not a definition of fear, it's just the label we give to a type of emotion, a negative feeling about an envisaged undesirable event. And here are the intensity variables. The central variable is the undesirability of the envisaged event, and local variables, the likelihood of the event. Now, relief happens when this feared envisaged event doesn't actually occur or is believed not to have occurred. So we have a different type specification here. We have the positive feeling about the disconfirmation of an envisaged desirable event. And if you recall earlier where I showed you it, there was unconfirmed, disconfirmed, and confirmed. And the unconfirmed was the hope and fear types. The disconfirmed were the disappointment and relief types, and the confirmed were the fears confirmed, and I can't remember what it was, gratification, I think. Central and local variables, again, the undesirability here of the associated feared event, and any effort expended, here's a different local variable, the effort expended in trying to prevent the feared event from happening. So the driver felt relieved at having avoided a dangerous collision. Notice that not necessarily the case that the person had actually experienced fear prior to avoiding the collision, only that once avoided, relief was experienced. May have time to come back to that. The hope emotion is just the converse of this, but this is a case of what I call the none-to-one example. So a positive feeling about an envisaged desirable event. This is, think of looking forward to something. You haven't seen your very, very close friend for 5 years, and the plane touches down and you think, oh, whoopee, they're going to show up any minute. There's this anticipatory excitement, we like to call it. This, maybe you could imagine this person thinking, yes, surely it's going to happen now. So there are no words, there are no tokens for it, but there are expressions that we can use: anticipatory excitement, excited about, hope, and hopeful. Again, this is an interesting, I'm planning to write a paper on this because hope and hopeful are very different and neither quite captures this. Hope is the wanting and hopeful is the sort of optimism, the belief that it's more likely than not, and so on, looking forward to. So this is just to show that there are these cases where you have no real emotion word in English, but you have a recognizable emotion that we characterize in this way: emotion type, a positive feeling about an envisaged desirable event. So finally, and I think we started a little late, so maybe I can just take two or three more minutes. When is an emotion not an emotion? And this kind of cryptic question is meant to tease you. And the answer is when an emotion potential, which is purely cognitive, is below its emotion threshold. So what do I mean by this? I mentioned the possibility that you realize that you must have left your wallet, which fortunately had only $2 in it, on the train. As you reminisce about this, you appraise this situation as being, yeah, well, that's not something I really wanted to happen. It's kind of minimally undesirable. But you're certainly not afraid or anxious or worried. You really don't care very much. So it seems to have satisfied the emergence condition because you envisaged an undesirable event, but it's of insufficient intensity for you to have an emotional experience. And now let's ramp it up from $2 to $200 or $500. And at some point, as you go from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, at some point, you're going to actually experience an emotion. You're going to feel worried that you really did lose it or somehow upset. And that means whatever emotion is there, and in this case, I'm thinking it's going to be a fear emotion because you're not certain that you left it there. You're envisaging that prospect. You cross a threshold and you get into an emotional state. But clearly you're not in the state at $2 and you are in the state at 200. The only way that I can think of solving this problem of how do you deal with the transition from non-emotion to emotion when the emergence condition has been satisfied is that the change from this purely cognitive to this emotional state can be thought of in the same way as physicists think of phase transitions. When water turns to steam or to ice, depending on whether the temperature is going up or down, there is no particular temperature, that just at some point the change occurs. The change is actually a change of state from the liquid to the gaseous state, or from, in the case of water to ice, from the liquid to the solid state. And you can sort of reason analogically that this is very much like going from 2 to 200, going from 15 Celsius to -5 Celsius. And suddenly at some point, what happens is the water solidifies. A threshold is crossed. Finally, how do we formalize emotions? Well, since I've talked about relief a lot, because I hate talking always about the same old examples everybody always uses. Let me just show you briefly how, for those of you who are not familiar with this, how it can be formalized. I'm not saying this is the right way or that the formalism is completely kosher, but the general idea is that we have some function, the envisaging function, which has 3 parameters: a person, an event, and a time. So this is if P envisages some event E at time T, and this is the desirability. The desirability of event E for P at time T is less than 0, okay? We're assuming we can compute desirability, give you a tachistoscopic view of how that might be done, and then immediately take it away. It's possible, in theory at least, to go through some network like this and compute the relative importance or desirability of different stages of some causal network like this, but I think I haven't time for that now. That's all elaborated in, I think, chapter 3 of the new book. Anyway, so if the desirability is negative, it's undesirable, then you set this fear potential that I just talked about for person P with respect to event E at time T, and it's some sort of function, a fear-dependent function of desirability of the event, the local variable, the likelihood, and the global variables. So these are the 3 variables. Desirability is the central variable for all emotions on that central branch, on the event-based branch. Likelihood is a local variable for intensity of fear emotions, and these are any global variables that may be operative. So we just read this as if P envisages event E and evaluates it as undesirable at time T. then the value of fear potential is set as a function of the undesirability and likelihood together that we influence of global variables. Now, I'd be the first to concede how you actually quantify these, I don't know, but that doesn't mean that it's not in principle representable. Now, the second rule here would be if fear potential is greater than 0. Okay, so there is fear potential. The emergence condition has been satisfied. And person P doesn't believe that event E at time T, person doesn't believe that event E. Time T can be either at the same moment or it can be later, but obviously can't be before it. Then you set relief potential for time T2 as a function of the fear potential and the effort invested, which is the local variable for relief as well. Effort invested in trying to avoid the undesirable event and any global variables. And I think at this point I should stop because this is just a further elaboration. So let me quickly sum up to say that emotions are about how we make sense of what's going on in our world, and this always is a cognitive process, so the cognition aspect of emotions is always present, even if other concomitants, such as facial expressions, may not be. I think the idea of OCC is to show that it's possible to conceptualize emotions without resorting to emotion words, using as much as possible cultural and linguistically neutral ways of characterizing interpretations of situations, that it's possible to conceptualize emotions without appealing to basic emotions, although we obviously do appeal to feeling good and feeling bad, or positive and negative feelings as somehow irreducible. And it's possible to conceptualize emotions with sufficient specificity to be implementable, but that this whole enterprise should be evaluated in terms of its utility for thinking about how to deal with issues in affective computing, rather than whether the approach itself is correct. We're sure it's not absolutely correct. We're sure that it can be changed and improved, as the Steinebrook and Brink and others have shown. So with that, having run over a little, I want to say thank you, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and I'm going to clap on behalf of everyone. That you can mute.